A small mountain town sat quietly between tall ridges, the kind of place where people knew every face and every story that floated around. Most stories were ordinary, but one story stayed alive generation after generation. People spoke softly about the red dragons, a rare species of giant gliding lizards that lived deep in the mountains. They were not real dragons that breathed fire, but their size, color, and grace made them feel mythical. Most locals believed they were almost gone from the world. Some believed they were already extinct. Others thought they still watched humans from the shadows, keeping their families hidden far from people. The man who lived in the town never paid much attention to these tales. He worked as a volunteer wildlife watcher who simply liked quiet mountains and peaceful trails. His job was simple: check cameras, write small reports, and help track any rare animals that might still be living around the region. He preferred observing creatures from a distance and never bothered them unless they looked sick or trapped. He believed every living thing deserved space to survive. During one winter week, strange reports began to spread around the town. Farmers said something powerful was moving through the hills at night. Livestock went missing, not many, but enough to make people uneasy. Some hikers said they heard strong wing-like flutters in the sky, even though no known bird in those mountains had wings that large. Others claimed they saw shadows sliding across cliff faces as if something big was gliding down the slopes. Most people laughed it off, but the older folks shook their heads and whispered that the red dragons were restless again. They said the mountains always gave warnings before something unusual happened. The wildlife department asked the man to check the northern ridge where most reports were coming from. It was an isolated area with old quarries, fallen rocks, and narrow paths that were not used much anymore. The department wanted updated information because the area might need special protection if a rare species was truly moving around. The man packed his bag early in the morning. He carried a small camera, a notebook, water, and a simple kit in case he found an injured animal. He set out before sunrise. The sky was pale and cold. Mist rested between the trees like soft smoke. The path was rough, but he moved carefully, listening to the quiet, just as he always did. He enjoyed mornings like these. The mountains felt honest at this hour. No traffic, no loud voices, no distractions. Only the wind and the faint crunch of his steps. After 2 hours of walking, he reached the old quarry area. The light here was different. The cliffs were high, and the shadows made the whole place feel like a huge stone bowl. He checked the ground for tracks, expecting signs of wolves or large birds. But he found claw marks that looked too spaced out, too wide, and too deep to belong to anything he recognized. He paused and crouched lower. The marks ran in a pattern that looked both careful and powerful, as if the creature that made them moved with purpose. The man took photos, but he didn't jump to conclusions. Nature was full of surprises. Sometimes strange tracks came from animals dragging their paws or slipping on rocks. He wrote notes in simple words so he could review them later. As he moved deeper into the quarry, he felt a soft vibration in the ground, almost like a distant echo. Not an earthquake, not heavy machinery. Something else. A kind of sound that seemed alive. He looked up toward the ridges, but the sky was empty. Still, something felt different. He walked toward a narrow ravine that split the quarry. The air there was colder. The rocks were sharp and broken, as if something had slid or crashed through recently. He could hear faint noises, almost like tiny chirps. At first, he thought it was a bird nest, but the sound was too low and too weak. He followed it slowly. The ravine dipped downward, and the light dimmed. He stepped carefully to avoid loose stones. As he reached the bottom, he finally saw where the sound came from. 2 small creatures huddled under a flat piece of stone. Their bodies were trembling. Their skin was a deep red color with soft highlights that shimmered when the light touched them. Their wings were short and folded tightly against their sides. They looked tired, cold, and frightened. The man froze. He knew instantly what they were, or at least what they looked like. These were not ordinary lizards. These were the young ones people only talked about in old stories, the hatchlings of the red dragons. They were smaller than adults, but still impressive in size, each about as long as a person's arm. Their eyes were bright, but full of fear. For a long moment, the man simply watched them. He didn't want to startle them. He could see scratches on their legs and a tear on one wing. They were clearly injured, maybe from falling, maybe from getting stuck under the rubble. Whatever happened, they wouldn't survive long in this condition. Especially as the temperature dropped. He inched closer, moving slow enough that they could see every step. They hissed weakly at first, trying to defend themselves, even though they barely had the strength. The man lowered himself onto the rocks and spoke softly, not expecting them to understand, but trying to show he meant no harm. His voice stayed calm, steady, warm. After a few moments, their hissing faded. They still watched him with wide eyes, but they no longer tried to crawl away. One of them tried to lift its head, but collapsed back onto the stone. The man recognized signs of exhaustion and dehydration. They needed warmth. They needed stillness. They needed safety. He opened his jacket carefully and placed it on the ground. Then he gently picked up one hatchling with slow hands. Its body felt cool and fragile. He placed it into the jacket like a small blanket. The second one crawled forward on its own, moving shakily, and settled near his chest. The man stayed very still, letting them adjust. Their trembling slowly decreased as they pressed closer to his body for warmth. He knew their parents, if they were alive, would be looking for them. And if the old stories were true, adult red dragons were extremely protective. They did not tolerate threats to their young. The man was aware that being found with the hatchlings would be dangerous, but the alternative, leaving them in the cold, was something he couldn't imagine doing. He stayed there quietly, sitting against the stone wall as the hatchlings rested. Their breathing softened. Their small claws gently gripped his shirt. Their wings relaxed. The man looked up at the sky through the thin opening of the ravine. He wondered where their parents were. He wondered how long he had before they returned. The mountain breeze grew colder. The shadows stretched. Evening would come soon. The man didn't move. He didn't panic. He simply listened to the quiet and felt the weight of the two small lives trusting him without, understanding who he was. Somewhere far above the ravine, a faint cry echoed through the cliffs. A deep, distant sound carried on the wind. The man lifted his head slightly. The hatchlings stirred with a tiny shiver, as if they recognized the call. He exhaled slowly. Whatever made that sound was getting closer, and it was coming for them. The man stayed in the ravine for a long time without moving. The two hatchlings rested against his torso, their breathing slow and uneven. Their tiny bodies were warm now, but they were still weak. Every few minutes one of them made a small chirp, as if dreaming or calling softly. He didn't know much about their species, but he could tell they were scared and tired. The stones around them were cold, the shadows deep, and the place felt far from anything safe. He looked upward at the narrow opening of the ravine. The sky above was turning pale orange as the sun began to set. A quiet breeze rolled through, bringing with it the scent of pine and dust. Everything felt peaceful, but the man knew it wouldn't stay peaceful for long. Creatures this rare did not move alone. If the hatchlings were here, their family had to be somewhere nearby. His heart was steady but alert. He wasn't afraid of animals, but he respected wild instincts. If the adults returned suddenly and saw him holding their young, things could go very wrong. Yet he couldn't leave the hatchlings either. They needed warmth, protection, and calm. He carefully shifted his weight, trying not to disturb them. One opened its eyes and looked up at him. Its eyes were bright red, like glowing marbles. It wasn't aggressive, just curious, watching this strange creature holding it. The man gave a small, gentle smile, though he knew the creature didn't understand the gesture. Still, something in the hatchling's gaze softened. Minutes passed. Then an odd sound reached him again, a deep, faraway rumble traveling across the cliffs. It wasn't loud, but it carried strength, like a warning or a call. The man felt the hatchlings stiffen against him. Their wings twitched. Their claws tightened slightly on his shirt. "That must be your family," he whispered softly, more to himself than to them. The sound came again, a little closer this time. Not like thunder, not like a storm. It was alive, heavy, and full of emotion. It echoed against the rocky walls, rolling into the ravine like a slow wave. The man took a deep breath. He knew he had to be calm. Panic would only make things worse. He slowly adjusted the jacket around the hatchlings, so their bodies were covered but still warm. They pressed closer into his chest, feeling more frightened than before. He listened carefully. After a few moments, he heard something else like gravel shifting somewhere above. Then another sound, like a strong flap of wings, pushing against the air. It wasn't close yet, but it was following the path toward the ravine. He leaned his head back and stared upward again. He couldn't see anything through the narrow gap, but he knew something was coming. His mind raced, but not in fear. He was thinking about what to do, how to stay non-threatening, how to show he wasn't harming the young. He had seen protective animal parents before wolves, bears, even large birds. If he moved suddenly, or looked like he was trying to escape, the adults might attack first and think later. So he did the only thing that made sense. He stayed still. The minutes felt long. The sky grew darker. Then he heard it clearly, a heavy landing somewhere above the ravine. Dust and tiny stones trickled down from the ridge. The hatchlings chirped again, this time in a thin, desperate sound. They were calling for the adults, or maybe warning the man, or maybe both. Another wingbeat shook the air. Then another. A low growl rolled down the cliff like a slow drum. The man swallowed. His heartbeat picked up, but he kept his breathing steady. He reminded himself that he had done nothing to harm the creatures. He had only kept them warm. Still, wild parents didn't always see such things clearly. Slowly, shadows moved across the ravine's opening. Large, long shapes stretched across the rocks like shifting flames. The man felt the air grow warmer for a second, as if something massive exhaled above him. Then a head appeared. It was huge, bigger than he imagined. It slid down into sight, its red scales glowing faintly in the fading light. Its eyes were the same bright red as the hatchlings, but deeper, older, filled with strength. The adult looked straight at him, studying everything: his posture, his hands, the hatchlings resting on him. He didn't move. The adult didn't make a sound. Then another head appeared beside the first, and then a third, smaller one. They were positioned above him, like silent watchers, their wings partly folded, claws gripping the rocks with ease. The man felt their gaze like a heavy weight. Every instinct in his body wanted to step back, to run, to hide. But he stayed still, letting them see the hatchlings clearly. One of the adult dragons lowered its head a little closer. The man felt a deep breath wash over him. It wasn't hot or cold, it was just powerful, as if the creature was smelling him, reading him. The hatchlings chirped softly. They didn't try to escape from his jacket. They simply pressed closer to him, trusting the warmth. The adults noticed this. Their eyes moved from the hatchlings to his face, then back again. A long moment passed, then the largest adult growled, not a warning growl, not a threatening growl. It was more like a frustrated or worried sound, the kind a parent makes when it finds its young hurt or missing. The growl echoed through the ravine walls, shaking dust loose. The man slowly lowered his eyes to the hatchlings, letting the adults see that he wasn't claiming them. He wasn't trying to run. He wasn't fighting. He was simply present, offering warmth until their parents arrived. One of the adults stepped closer to the edge of the ravine and leaned down farther. Its claws scraped the rock, sending sparks of red dust falling. Its wings spread just slightly, forming a half curve around the opening as if guarding the area. The man felt the meaning instantly. They weren't attacking. They were taking control of the space, letting him know they were here now. He stayed quiet, staying exactly as he was. His breathing grew calmer. He felt a strange sense of relief, though he knew the situation was still dangerous. The largest adult, the one with deeper red scales, extended its neck. Its snout hovered only a few feet from the man's chest. The hatchlings chirped again, this time in a soft tone. The adult's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the way the small bodies rested on him. It was noticing everything. The way the hatchling's claws lightly held onto his shirt. The way they breathed steadily. The way they didn't show fear around him. The way he didn't restrain them. The adult finally blinked. A slow blink. The man didn't know much about the species. But in many animals, a slow blink was a sign of understanding. Or at the very least, no immediate threat. Carefully, he lowered one hand, not to grab anything, but to show the hatchlings. He wanted the adults to see he wasn't hiding weapons or trying to harm their young. The adults watched every movement closely. Then, in a surprising moment, one of the hatchlings crawled slightly upward along his chest and let out a faint, weak chirp toward the adult. It sounded almost like a greeting. The adult responded with a soft rumble. Not loud, not angry. More like a reply. The man felt his shoulders relax for the first time since the sounds began. He still knew he had to be careful, but he could sense something shifting. The adults weren't here to attack him. They were here to find their young. And now that they saw the hatchlings safe, they were no longer reacting with blind fear or rage. The man slowly adjusted the jacket again, giving the hatchlings a little more space. One adult tilted its head slightly, following the motion. It didn't growl. It didn't snap. It simply watched. There was no sudden burst of danger. No panic. Just a strange, delicate balance between him and the majestic creatures above. The hatchlings were resting on him. The adults were watching from above. The mountain was silent, except for their breaths. And in that moment, the man understood something important. The adults were not just powerful. They were intelligent, and now they were trying to figure out what kind of human he was. The air inside the ravine felt heavy, as if the whole mountain was holding its breath. The man sat very still with the two hatchlings resting on his torso, their tiny claws lightly gripping his shirt. They were warmer now, but still weak. Every time the adults above shifted their weight, small pebbles rolled down the walls, making soft clicking sounds as they bounced off the rocks. The adults stood at the top edge of the ravine, like silent statues. Their wings were half opened, catching the remaining light of the evening. Their red scales glowed faintly, like embers under a layer of dust. They looked powerful, but they also looked worried. The man could sense it in the way they breathed, and the way their eyes kept moving back and forth between him and the hatchlings. The largest adult, the one who seemed to be the leader, slowly lowered its head again. Its breath was deep and steady. The man didn't know what the creature was thinking, but the look in its eyes didn't feel threatening. It felt searching, questioning, almost protective. He didn't try to talk out loud. He didn't want sudden noises to alarm them. Instead, he kept his breathing slow and careful. His hands rested on the ground, so the adults could see he wasn't hiding anything. He tried to look calm, even though his heart was beating. Harder than before, He knew he had to let the adults understand that he meant no. Harm got one of the hatchlings made a weak chirping sound and shifted a little against him. The movement drew the attention of the adults instantly. Their heads lowered more, their sharp eyes focusing on their young. The man felt the warm little body adjusting itself, trying to get more comfortable. It pressed its head against his chest like a tired animal searching for warmth. The adults saw everything. There was another soft rumble from the leader. Not loud, not sharp. It was low and long, like a note full of emotion. The man felt the vibration in the rocks. The hatchlings reacted quietly, almost as if answering. Their tiny heads lifted slightly before relaxing again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was tense, but not dangerous. More like two different worlds trying to understand each other. A few minutes passed. The man could tell the sun had almost disappeared. Shadows grew deeper in the ravine, and the cold air crept in again. The hatchlings snuggled closer to him, sharing the warmth of his body. Their breathing stayed soft and steady. One of the adults stepped closer to the edge. Its claws scraped the rock, but the movement wasn't fast or hostile. It leaned down and studied the ground, then looked at the man's hands again. Checking for any sign of threat, the man stayed absolutely still. He didn't even blink too fast. Afraid the adults might mistake sudden motion for danger, then something unexpected happened. The leader slowly extended its neck downward, bringing its snout even closer than before. Its nose was only a few feet away from the man's face. He could see tiny scars on its scales, the kind that came from years of living in the wild. He noticed how its eyes were not cold at all. They were sharp, yes, but full of awareness. For a moment, the leader simply breathed, drawing in the air around him and the hatchlings. The breath was strong, but controlled. It was smelling them, reading the situation. The man felt the warmth of that breath on his skin. He didn't move. The leader tilted its head slightly, as if trying to piece together what had happened. Maybe it smelled the coldness that once clung to the hatchlings. Maybe it sensed their exhaustion. Maybe it could tell they had been kept warm by him. Animals often understood more than people expected. Another adult moved closer and lowered its head too. Now 2 sets of bright red eyes watched him carefully. The third adult, smaller than the other 2, stayed back but kept looking nervously at the hatchlings, as though afraid to lose them again. The man slowly exhaled. His breath made a small cloud in the cold air. One of the hatchlings let out a tiny sound and lifted a wing a little. It wasn't trying to fly. It was just adjusting itself. The adults reacted instantly again, but this time their movements were softer. They made low rumbling replies that seemed to comfort the young ones. The man had seen protective animals before, but he had never witnessed this kind of awareness. It felt like the adults were not just reacting, they were thinking, studying, deciding. He could feel the hatchlings' trust. They didn't try to crawl away from the adults. Instead, they stayed against him, as if they knew he wasn't a danger. And for the first time since the adults arrived, the man felt the tension shifting. It was still present, but it was changing shape. It felt less like fear and more like curiosity. The leader slowly leaned closer, again, until its snout hovered directly above the hatchlings. Its breath brushed across them gently. It made a soft humming noise that felt almost like relief. It didn't grab them or force them away from the man. It simply acknowledged them. Then the leader's eyes moved to the man again. It blinked once. Slowly, the man blinked too. Not sure if he was imagining the moment, but something about it felt real, almost like a silent message. He breathed out again. His body relaxed a little, and the hatchlings seemed to copy him, their tiny claws loosening slightly. The adults were still close, but they were not acting like they wanted to harm him. Their stances were strong, yet controlled. Their wings folded slowly, showing they were not preparing to strike. It was as if the adults were saying, without words, "We see what you are doing. We understand you are not hurting them." The man's heart felt lighter, though he didn't let his guard down completely. These were powerful creatures, and he needed to respect their instincts. More time passed as they watched each other in the fading light. The mountain grew quieter. The sky above the ravine turned dark blue. A few stars appeared. The cold air deepened. The man felt the hatchlings shift again. They were getting sleepy. Their eyes blinked slowly. One let out a soft breath and rested its head fully on his chest. The other curled its tail slightly around the first. The leader noticed this too. It gave a low sound that almost resembled reassurance. The man wondered how long the adults would stay there. Would they eventually climb down to take their young? Or were they waiting for the hatchlings to gather enough strength to move on their own? He didn't know. He just stayed still and waited. Then he heard another sound, a slow, heavy movement behind the adults. Something else was approaching, something large enough to shift the gravel on the ridge. The adults reacted instantly, turning their heads sharply toward the sound. Their wings lifted slightly, creating a wall around the ravine's opening, but the man didn't sense fear in them. It felt more like preparation, as if they were expecting something. A moment later, another adult appeared larger than the others, with darker red scales and a more pronounced crest along its head. It moved with purpose, stepping carefully to the edge of the ravine. Its eyes immediately searched for the hatchlings. When it saw them resting on the man, its breath caught in a deep, emotional sound. Not anger, not aggression. It felt almost like heartbreak mixed with relief. The new adult leaned closer, just like the others had, and allowed the warm air to flow over the hatchlings. The man felt the emotional weight of that moment. This adult looked like it had been searching desperately. The hatchlings responded softly, lifting their heads just enough to chirp faintly. The adult lowered its snout close to them. Touching the edge of the jacket gently, the man could feel something shifting again, something deeper now, something more certain. The adults had found what they were looking for. They saw their young alive. They saw their young safe, and they saw the human who kept them warm. When they needed it most, the mountain stayed silent as the adults stood guard around him. Their wings half opened, their eyes calmer now. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, and the man realized that the danger he once expected was slowly turning into something else, something closer to understanding. The night had fully settled over the mountain by the time the man realized just how still the ravine had become. The wind had calmed, and the only sound came from the distant trees swaying and the occasional soft rustle of pebbles from the adults, shifting their weight. The hatchlings had grown more relaxed on his chest, their tiny claws resting lightly against his clothing. He could feel their warmth slowly spreading into his body, steady and calm, like a living heartbeat pressed against his own. Above him, the adults had formed a loose circle around the edge of the ravine. Their wings were partially folded, eyes alert, but no longer filled with the tension of the hunt. Every so often, one of them would emit a low rumble or flick its tail over the rocks. It wasn't threatening. It was the quiet rhythm of creatures confident in their control over their territory, but also careful, protective, and aware. The man understood that he was inside their world, not separate from it. He shifted his hands slightly, not to disturb the hatchlings, but to make sure they were safe. One of the younglings lifted its head and blinked up at him, then let out a soft, almost thankful chirp. The other nestled deeper, tail wrapped gently around the first. He exhaled slowly. Despite the danger, he felt a strange sense of connection to these creatures. They were not animals in the ordinary sense. They were beings with intelligence, with awareness, with feelings, parents watching over their children, and him, an unexpected participant, had become part of their story for a short moment in time. Suddenly, the largest adult, the leader, leaned down again. Its gaze, intense and glowing in the faint moonlight, rested on the hatchlings and then moved to the man. It sniffed the air softly, a deliberate and careful movement, almost as if trying to read his intent fully. The man's pulse quickened slightly, but he didn't move. He had learned from the earlier moments that sudden action could create fear or aggression. He stayed perfectly still, calm, and present. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the contours of his face, the way his hands rested on the rocks, the way the hatchlings clung to him. For a long minute, it simply observed, its massive body tense but not threatening. Then, slowly, it lowered its snout closer to the hatchlings, breathing gently. The smaller adult beside it followed, leaning toward the young ones, scanning them, checking for injuries. The man noticed that the faint scratches and tired posture of the hatchlings seemed to soften the expression of the adult dragons. They were relieved, but still cautious, as though every movement mattered. The man exhaled quietly. He realized he had entered a delicate balance. One wrong move, one sudden sound, and the entire scenario could collapse. But for now, the adults were watching, assessing, and surprisingly, trusting him. That trust was fragile and quiet, but it was there. It was given because he had done nothing but provide warmth and safety when it was needed most. The hatchlings stirred slightly. One lifted its tiny wings a little, stretching them gently. The movement drew a flurry of attention from the adults. Their heads moved together as if a single organism, scanning, monitoring, and protecting. The man noticed how synchronized they were, their senses alert to even the smallest shift. It was breathtaking how nature could create such instinctive coordination among creatures so powerful and intelligent. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time seemed suspended in that dark, cold ravine. The man stayed still, letting the adults see that he posed no threat. The hatchling slept or rested quietly on his torso, safe in the warmth he provided. The adults occasionally shifted, brushing lightly against the rocks with their claws, but nothing aggressive occurred. They were focused entirely on their young. Then something extraordinary happened. The largest adult lowered its head, nose almost touching the man's hand, and made a soft, deep rumble. It was not a growl. It was not a warning. It was almost like a communication, a careful acknowledgement, as though the adult was saying, without words, "We see you. You have helped our young. We know your intent is not harm." The man felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't move, didn't react. Instead, he nodded ever so slightly, as if responding to a message that could not be spoken in human language. The hatchlings stirred again, lifting their heads to nuzzle against the man's chest. One of the adults leaned closer, sniffing the air around him, almost as if confirming that nothing had been done to harm the young. The man's heart pounded quietly, but he felt more calm than before. He realized he was being accepted in a very cautious, yet undeniable way. Hours seemed to pass. The moonlight slipped further into the ravine, casting a silver glow over the scene. The adults didn't leave. They didn't rush. They simply stayed close, creating a protective circle, their eyes on the hatchlings, on him, and on every subtle sound in the mountain. The man's muscles ached from sitting still, but he didn't mind. He couldn't disturb the delicate peace of this moment. He thought about how fragile life could be, even for creatures so strong and seemingly untouchable. One moment, the hatchlings had been alone, vulnerable, and trembling. Now they were safe, guarded by their powerful parents, yet still connected to him, an outsider, a human who had provided warmth when no one else could. A slight sound came from the ridge above. A rock shifted underfoot. The adults immediately tensed, wings fluttering slightly as they adjusted their balance. The man noticed how quickly they responded, to even the smallest stimuli. Their awareness was astonishing. He had seen wild animals before, but nothing with this level of coordination and focus. They moved as a single unit, protecting what mattered most to them. The hatchlings stirred slightly again, chirping softly. The adults responded with a soft, low rumble, a gentle exchange of communication that the man could not understand, but somehow felt the meaning of. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern, a flow. The man realized that these creatures, often feared and misunderstood, were capable of emotion, care, and intelligence far beyond what most humans ever imagined. Time passed in quiet observation. The man could feel a subtle relaxation among the adults, a shift from tense guardianship to careful acknowledgement. They had assessed him. They had understood his actions. They had allowed him into their immediate space without aggression. It was an extraordinary moment of connection between two very different species. Then, slowly, the leader moved its head slightly back, scanning the ravine one last time. Its eyes lingered on the hatchlings, on him, and on the space around them. Another adult followed the movement, and then the third, creating a subtle but clear acknowledgement of completion. They had accepted the situation, and the man understood that their trust, though fragile, had been extended to him. The man exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. His body had been tense, his mind alert for hours, but now a quiet relief washed through him. The hatchlings, sensing the change, snuggled even closer, trusting both him and the adults around them. Their tiny bodies vibrated softly with warmth, a silent affirmation that all was well. The night continued quietly. Stars twinkled faintly in the clear sky above, and the mountain seemed to hold its breath, observing the unusual scene. The man stayed still, listening to the soft rumbles, the gentle flaps of wings, the faint sounds of breath and movement. Each detail was vivid, each moment precious dot in that silent, cold, and dark ravine. Something extraordinary had occurred. The man had not simply survived the encounter. He had become part of it. The adults had recognized his intent. They had acknowledged his care for their young. And in turn, he had witnessed an extraordinary display of intelligence, protection, and emotion from creatures the world had long misunderstood. It was a night the man would never forget. Not because it was dangerous or thrilling, but because it had been real, raw, authentic, and full of life. He had entered a world that few humans would ever see, and he had been accepted, even if only for a moment, into the lives of creatures so different, yet so connected to the same need for care, trust, and understanding. The hatchlings slowly drifted into deeper rest. Their tiny bodies warmed against his chest, their breathing soft and rhythmic. The adults, satisfied, kept their positions around the ravine, their eyes still alert but calm. The man allowed himself a small, quiet smile. He had done what mattered most. He had provided warmth, safety, and stillness. And in return, he had been acknowledged by beings many only dreamed of seeing. And as the mountain night stretched on, the man realized that this encounter was more than just survival. It was a moment of understanding, a connection across species, a bridge between human compassion and wild instinct. One day, he knew, people might hear the stories and doubt them. But he knew the truth. He had felt it. He had been there. And in that ravine, under the cold moonlight, life in all its fragile, magnificent form had revealed itself to him. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the mountain ridge, painting the ravine in soft gold and pink. The cold night had passed, leaving the rocks sparkling with frost. The man had not moved much, keeping the hatchlings close, ensuring their warmth and safety through the long hours. The adults had stayed around the edges of the ravine throughout the night, forming a protective circle. They had allowed him to be close to their young, a rare acceptance that left him in awe. Now, as the day slowly awakened, The scene felt almost magical, a fragile balance between human and creature. A quiet moment of understanding that most people would never witness. The hatchlings stirred with the growing light, their tiny wings stretching slightly. One opened its eyes fully and blinked at him, then shifted closer to rest its head against his chest. The man smiled softly, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. They were safe. They had survived the night. The parents were there, strong and vigilant, but they had allowed him to share this moment with their young. It was more than survival. It was trust, earned quietly and carefully. Above, the adults had begun to move. Not aggressively, not hurriedly, but with deliberate, careful steps along the cliffs and rocks. They were repositioning themselves, scanning the ravine and the surrounding mountains. The man noticed their movements were synchronized, almost like a dance of guardianship. Each adult kept one eye on the hatchlings, one eye on him, and one eye on the mountain paths that might hold danger. Their awareness was extraordinary, their attention unwavering. He took a slow, quiet breath. He knew he couldn't stay forever. The hatchlings needed to return to their parents, and the adults needed to resume their life in the wild. But a part of him hesitated. He had spent hours with them, felt their warmth, shared their vulnerability, and had seen their intelligence and awareness. To walk away now would be difficult. And yet, he also knew that the right thing was to step back and allow nature to continue. Carefully, he shifted slightly, making sure the hatchlings did not feel the movement. They adjusted, curling back against his chest, trusting him to keep them safe until the moment came. He let his hands rest lightly on the jacket, ensuring they were secure, but not restrained. They were small, fragile, and still exhausted from the night. Yet their trust had grown in that brief time, and he could feel it as clearly as he felt their tiny heartbeats against his own. One of the adults, the leader, leaned down again. Its eyes met his, and he sensed an acknowledgement, a silent recognition of what he had done. No growls, no threats, no hostility, just understanding. The man's throat tightened slightly as he realized how rare this was. To witness such creatures, to have their trust, even for a short time, was extraordinary. Few humans had ever been allowed such proximity without fear or aggression. The hatchlings began to shift more, as if understanding the change in the adult's posture. They lifted their tiny heads, stretching wings that still had small tears, and chirped softly. The adults responded with low, rumbling sounds, gentle and measured. The man realized that this was communication, an exchange of feelings, warnings, reassurance. He could not understand the sounds as words, but he understood the meaning. Safety, recognition, guidance. The parents were telling the hatchlings it was time to move, to return to their family's care fully, while still acknowledging the human who had helped them through the night. He slowly lowered his hands, making space for the hatchlings to shift if they wanted. One of them lifted slightly, tilting its head toward its parent above. The adult leaned down and nudged it gently with its snout, a quiet, careful touch. The hatchling responded with a soft chirp, and finally lifted its tiny body from his chest. It looked at him once, eyes bright and trusting, before fluttering awkwardly to the edge where its parent awaited. The other hatchling followed, stretching wings and tail, moving with more confidence than before. The man watched silently, heart pounding, as the reunion unfolded. The adults circled their young, guiding them gently, their massive wings creating a protective barrier around the small creatures. It was delicate and precise, a dance of instinct, care, and intelligence. The hatchlings leaned against their parents, pressing into their warm bodies, comforted and secure. The man's chest ached with emotion as he witnessed this. He had not interfered with nature. He had become a part of it, a brief link between two species that rarely, if ever, crossed paths in such a way. Finally, the adults stepped back, spreading their wings and glancing at him once more. The largest adult, the leader, inclined its head slowly, deliberately, as if bowing in acknowledgement. A soft rumble emerged from its throat, not threatening, not demanding, but almost like a thank you. The man understood the gesture. He had not taken the hatchlings by force. He had not harmed them. He had provided warmth, safety, and patience. And now he was being recognized for that simple act. He exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of peace he had never experienced in his life. The night of tension, uncertainty, and fear had passed. What remained was understanding, connection, and respect. He knew he had been changed by this experience, and that the creatures, too, would carry the memory of his presence. Even if in their own way, the adults rose fully, stretching their wings to catch the morning air. They flapped lightly, testing their strength, then walked toward the edge of the ravine. The hatchlings followed closely, guided and protected. The man watched as the group ascended the ridge, moving with power and grace, disappearing gradually into the rocky landscape. Their red scales reflected the first rays of sunlight, making them appear almost like fire against the pale sky. He stood silently, letting the sight imprint itself into his memory. He realized that these creatures were not just animals or legends. They were intelligent, emotional, and deeply connected to their family and territory. They had taught him patience, trust, and humility in a way no classroom or book ever could. And in that quiet mountain morning, he felt privileged to have shared even a small moment of their lives. The man slowly began to walk back down the ravine. His legs ached, his body stiff from hours of stillness, but his mind felt alive. Every detail of the night replayed in his head: the way the hatchlings had rested, the subtle movements of the adults, the way they communicated without words, and the trust that had been shared. He knew the story would be hard for others to believe, yet it didn't matter. The experience was real. It was true. It had happened, and he carried it with him like a treasure dot as he reached the lower part of the ravine. He glanced back once more. The ridge was empty now, the dragons gone from sight. The morning breeze carried a faint rustle of wings far in the distance, a reminder that they were still out there, alive, free, and strong. He smiled quietly, feeling a mixture of awe and gratitude. Nature had allowed him to witness something extraordinary, and he had honored it by being patient, calm, and present. When he returned to the town, he didn't shout about what he had seen. He didn't try to prove it immediately. He simply recorded his notes, photos, and observations carefully. He wrote down everything: the details of the hatchlings, the adults, their movements, their sounds, and the trust that had been shared. He knew that someday people might study it, verify it, and appreciate the rarity of what had occurred. But more importantly, he knew it had changed him. He thought about the hatchlings and their parents throughout the day. He imagined them soaring over the mountains, the early morning light glinting off their red scales. He thought of the careful, deliberate way the adults had protected their young, and the brief trust they had given him. That trust, he realized, was a gift, a rare, fragile acknowledgement that humans and wild creatures could, under the right circumstances, understand each other without fear or conflict. And in the quiet of his own home later that evening, he reflected on the night he had spent in the ravine. The danger had not been in the creatures themselves, but in misunderstanding. The lesson was simple yet profound. Patience, respect, and calm could bridge gaps that seemed impossible. He smiled softly, thinking that maybe this was what the stories of the dragons had always tried to teach, that wildness and humanity could meet, not as enemies, but as participants in the same living world. He knew he would return someday, not to interfere, not to take, but to observe and respect. The dragons had shared something extraordinary, and he had learned to honor it fully. The memory of that night, of their eyes, their wings, their trust, would remain with him forever, a story of connection and understanding that few would ever witness, but that he would carry quietly in his heart. And so, the man walked back into his own life, forever changed, forever aware that the mountains held secrets of life, intelligence, and care that could not be fully explained, only experienced. He had seen the red dragons protect their hatchlings, recognize his presence, and allow him into their fragile, magnificent world. That trust, that silent acknowledgement, was a gift, a reminder that even in the wild, even in danger, understanding and compassion could exist. The hatchlings were safe. The adults had returned to their territory, and the man had learned the power of quiet, careful presence, the kind that could change not just a moment, but a life.